Before servicing this snowblower, always remove the batteries. To access the auger/gear case assembly, start by removing the two 5mm hex bolts behind the deck. These secure a steel brace that attaches to the gear case assembly. Next, loosen and remove the two shear pins to free the augers from the shaft. This requires an impact driver with a 4mm hex bit and an open 10mm wrench. Using a 5mm hex bit, remove the three flange bolts on each side of the unit. The augers and gear case assembly can now be removed and separated, as shown here. Before reassembly, be sure to replace any parts that are worn. When replacing the gear case, remove the steel brace using a 6mm hex bit. This brace and the washer under it will be reused. To mount the augers onto the gear case assembly, mount one gasket onto the shaft on each side. Note that the augers are not identical. Each has a hole that must be aligned with the hole in the shaft in order to insert the shear pin. If the holes cannot be aligned, the augers are mounted on the wrong sides. With the augers in place, reattach the steel brace to the gear case assembly using the 6mm hex screws. Do not tighten these screws yet, to allow for later adjustments. Next, mount the flanges on each side of the auger shaft. The bushings face toward the inside and should be replaced if worn. Now mount the auger/gear case assembly, making sure the flange slot aligns with the bulge on each side of the deck. Then insert, but do not tighten, the three flange bolts on each side. Connect the steel brace to the top of the deck using the two 5mm hex bolts. You can now tighten the bolt that secures the brace to the gear case assembly. The three flange bolts on each side can also be tightened. Once these bolts are secure, rotate the auger by hand to make sure it moves freely. This will require some force. The impeller is secured by one snap ring and one split pin. Remove these from the motor shaft using the tools shown here. During reassembly, be sure to bend the split pin so it remains in place. To replace the motor assembly, the augers and gear case assembly must be removed, along with the impeller. This will also require removal of the battery box and the PCBA assembly. To remove the battery box, start by removing the four T20 Torx screws that secure the PCBA box cover. Then remove the battery box cover, secured on each side with a T20 Torx screw. Next, remove the five T20 Torx screws that secure the inner cover. This will expose the two electrical contacts. Continue by removing the six T20 Torx screws inside the battery box, 3 on each side. Then remove the four 5mm hex screws on the outside of the battery box, 2 on each side. Proceed by disconnecting the 6 plugs. Then remove the 5mm hex bolts that secure the PCBA assembly. 2 are adjacent to the assembly and 4 are inside the PCBA box, as shown here. The PCBA assembly can now be removed. To separate the motor assembly from the deck, remove the 8 5mm hex bits as shown here. Note, there is one screw that does not have to be removed. Before the motor assembly can be removed, both wheels must also be removed. Each wheel is secured with a locking pin and has a flat washer that should be set aside for reassembly. The wheel caps behind each wheel must also be removed. Each is secured with a 5mm hex bolt. The deck of the snowblower must also be removed. It is secured with 4 14mm bolts, 2 on each side. For safety, tip the unit onto its handles. The motor assembly is secured with 10 5mm hex bolts, 5 on each side of the unit. With these 10 bolts removed, the motor assembly can now be removed. When installing the new motor assembly, pass the wire from the self-propel unit through the housing. Then secure the 10 hex bolts. When fastening the deck to the motor assembly, follow the recommended torque for the 4 14mm bolts. Then return the unit to its upright position and secure the 5mm hex screws as shown here. Complete the repair by installing the impeller, augers, and gear case assembly. When replacing the wheels, make sure to mount them with the tread pattern pointing forward. Please refer to the EGO service diagram and parts list for the specific parts needed for this repair. Always use genuine EGO parts.